Let's look at some sources, secondary sources, to get a clearer view of the effects of this monumental encounter between Old World and New World. If you're using a physical reading packet, these are sources D and E. Starting with source D, which is from a book called 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus. Fantastic book, I highly recommend it. It's by Charles Mann. In this article, you will see the Columbian Exchange discussed, specifically effects on the New World or native populations. And I want you to think about, in these next two sources, positive and negative effects of the encounter between Old and New Worlds. Specifically, the source will cover exactly how the population declined so drastically among the natives after Europeans came to the New World. And by the time we're done with this source, I want you to be able to tell me what pigs have to do with the story, like little piggies, like the animal. Bigger picture questions include, should Columbus be judged for the long-term effects of his actions, or just for what he did? And if most Native Americans died for a reason that explorers could not have foreseen, is it still the explorers and Columbus's fault? If a person does something that sets in motion a whole chain of events, is that person responsible for the entire chain of events? Or if it's positive, can they take credit for it? So I'll start reading now. On May 30th, 1539, Hernando de Soto, a conquistador, landed his private army in Florida. De Soto was a novel figure, half warrior, half venture capitalist. He grew very rich, very young in Spanish America by becoming a market leader in the nascent slave trade. The profits helped to fund the conquest of the Inca, which made De Soto wealthier still. He accompanied Pizarro to Peru, burnishing his reputation for brutality. He personally tortured the Inca chief general before his execution. Literally looking for new worlds to conquer, De Soto returned to Spain soon after his exploits in Peru and persuaded the bored king to let him loose in North America with an expedition of his own. He sailed to Florida with 600 soldiers, 200 horses, and 300 pigs. From today's perspective, it is difficult to imagine the ethical system that could justify De Soto's subsequent actions. For 4 years, his force wandered through what are now Florida, Georgia, North and South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana, looking for gold and wrecking most everything it touched. The inhabitants often fought back vigorously, but they were baffled by the Spaniards' motives and astounded by the sight and sound of horses and guns. De Soto died of fever with his expedition in ruins. Along the way, though, he managed to rape, torture, enslave, and kill countless Indians. But the worst thing he did was entirely without malice. He brought pigs. It was a nervous time. Every afternoon, one of his force later recalled, several thousand Indian soldiers approached in canoes to within a stone's throw of the Spanish. Utterly without fear, De Soto crossed the river into what is now eastern Arkansas, a land thickly set with great towns, according to the soldiers' account. Each city protected itself with earthen walls, sizable moats, and dead-eye archers. In his brazen fashion, De Soto marched right in, demanded food, and marched out. After De Soto left, no Europeans visited this part of the Mississippi Valley for more than a century. Early in 1682, foreigners appeared again, this time Frenchmen, who passed through the area where De Soto had found cities everywhere. It was deserted. The French didn't see an Indian village for 200 miles. De Soto had a privileged glimpse of an Indian world. The window opened and slammed shut. When the French came in and the record opened up again, it was a transformed reality. A civilization crumbled. The question is, how did this happen? Today, most historians believe the culprit was disease. The source of contagion was very likely not De Soto's army, but its ambulatory meat locker, his 300 pigs. De Soto's company was too small to be an effective biological weapon. Sicknesses like measles and smallpox would have burned through his 600 men long before they reached the Mississippi. But that would not have been true for his pigs. Pigs were as essential to the conquistadors as horses. Spanish armies traveled in a porcine cloud. The lean, hungry animals circled the troops like darting dogs. Neither species regarded their arrangement as novel. They had lived together in Europe for millennia, for 1,000 years. When humans and domesticated animals share quarters, they are constantly exposed to each other's microbes. Over time, mutation lets animal diseases jump to people. Avian influenza, bird flu, becomes human influenza. Bovine rinderpest becomes human measles. Horsepox becomes human smallpox. Unlike Europeans, Indians did not live in constant contact with many animals. They domesticated only the dog, the turkey in Mesoamerica, and the llama, the alpaca, the Muscovy duck, and the guinea pig in the Andes. In some ways, this is not surprising. The New World had fewer animal candidates for taming than the Old. Moreover, few Indians carry the gene that permits adults to digest lactose, a form of sugar abundant in milk. Non-milk drinkers, one imagines, would be less likely to work at domesticating milk-giving animals. The fact is that what scientists call zoonotic disease was little known in the Americas. It's disease that comes from animals and jumps to people. By contrast, swine, pigs, mainstays of European agriculture, transmit anthrax, brucellosis, leptospirosis, trichinosis, and tuberculosis. Pigs breed exuberantly, that means they make a lot of babies, and can pass disease to deer and turkeys, which then can infect people. Only a few of De Soto's pigs would have had to wander off to contaminate the forest. The calamity wreaked by the De Soto expedition extended across the whole Southeast. The societies of the Caddo on the Texas-Arkansas border and the Coosa in western Georgia both disintegrated soon after. The Caddo had a taste for monumental architecture, public plazas, ceremonial platforms, mausoleums. After De Soto's army left, the Caddo stopped erecting community centers and began digging community cemeteries. Between the visits of De Soto and the French, the Caddoan population fell from about 200,000 to about 8,500, a drop of nearly 96%. In the 18th century, the tally shrank further to 1,400. An equivalent loss today would reduce the population of New York City to 56,000, not enough to fill Yankee Stadium. That's one reason whites think of Indians as nomadic hunters, Russell Thornton, an anthropologist at UCLA, said to me. Everything else, all the heavily populated urbanized societies, was wiped out. So pause. Note somewhere in your notes that disease decimated the native populations, and also try to explain how pigs factor into the story. Our next source comes from a book by Thomas Cahill called Heretics and Heroes, Chapter 1, and it's about how racism as we know it takes shape, but also on how discovering a new world caused Europeans to re-examine their own lives. Topics discussed in this article include the Columbian Exchange, long-term effects on European worldviews, so how the quest for glory and the language of God led to the development of modern racism, but also the rise of modern science. As we go through this article, think about positive and negative effects of the encounter between old and new worlds. Bigger picture guiding questions include, if a person does something that sets in motion a whole chain of events, is that person responsible for the entire chain of events? Can they take credit for the good stuff that comes out of it? And are they accountable for the bad stuff too? The historic encounter between the natives of the Americas and the societies of Europe was complex. Certainly, the richer and more structured societies the Spaniards would encounter among the Aztecs, the Inca, and the Maya, and their criminal despoliation, require a more extensive treatment than is possible in just a few paragraphs. But in all instances, whoever the tribes, whoever the Europeans, whatever the excuse, the cumulative result, so the end result, was depressingly similar, a genocide as extensive and cruel as any in history. Columbus was predisposed to success, unresponsive to setbacks, and blind to any obstacle that might lie in his path. He had a deep conviction of self-righteousness and the unlimited capacity for self-deception that usually accompanies that quality. He was intensely religious, and his religion was strongly providential, which means he believed in fate. That is, providential in regard to himself and his enterprise, though utterly lacking in regard for anyone who is not his patron or similarly on his side. Providential means having to do with destiny, so he's saying Columbus believed he had a special destiny, but really only applied it to himself and people that were on his side. He was a traveling salesman, full of empty charm. He was, in short, very nearly our contemporary, a completely self-made man, the first to claim our attention across the centuries. It's impossible to imagine Columbus existing before the disaster of the Black Death, which emptied so much of Europe and opened land ownership and other enterprises for the first time to men of no noble family line. If that field across the way belonged to my now dead neighbor and his dead family, and there are no enforceable claims upon it, what is to prevent me from claiming it? If the town's chief business, say shoemaking or distribution of farm products, which kept us all employed and a few of us in riches, is now in idleness because of so many deaths, what is to prevent me from starting it up again and claiming ownership? This is how the Black Death led to social mobility. Of course, I must carefully cloak my desires and my plan in the language of piety, of religion. I want only what God himself wants. To be quite successful, I must actually believe that this is so. It is a shock for the historian, contemplating this overnight transformation of medieval sensibility, in which virtually everything and everyone had a place and stayed there, into the more upwardly mobile, if slimier, sensibility of the early modern period. If I intend to make my fortune as an exploiter of one kind or another, an exploiter of something beyond myself, since I know that in myself I have nothing, not family or holdings or even knowledge, I must find something or someone appropriate to exploit, that is, something or someone virtually begging to be ripped off. In other words, the Black Death made social mobility possible, but people still needed an excuse to take what wasn't theirs. And so they had to find some idea or system of ideas to justify it. And at this point we hear, almost for the first time in Western history, the sounds of racism. The ancient Greeks had been racist, believing themselves to be the best, and all others to be seriously deficient, barbarians of one sort or another. But the Greek attitude never found a foothold in Catholic Europe, and the Christian Middle Ages, intolerant about religion, were full of cultural rather than racial chauvinism or intolerance. Those who persecuted Jews and more occasionally Muslims within their midst were not racists, for they found their old antagonists quite acceptable the moment they converted to Christianity. Medieval people may have been anti-Judaic in terms of their religion. They were not anti-Semitic in terms of the race. Anti-Semitism would require the aura of scientific proof, something that lay in the future. But it is in this period that the African slave trade begins to get underway, and that several varieties of humans, Canary Islanders, Black Africans, the Irish tribes beyond the pale of English colonization, and the native tribes of the Americas, began to be dehumanized, casually considered subhuman, fit only for manual labor, or worse. It is also in this period that we first hear mention of Jewish blood, at least in Spain, which serves as a harbinger of attitudes that will eventually infect all of Europe. And it is in Spain of this period that the phrase sangre azul, blue blood, begins to be bandied about, in reference to those whose lightness of skin allows the blueness of their veins, particularly on the backs of their hands or the undersides of their arms, to be displayed for all to acknowledge. The science of the Greeks had been largely lost in the era of medieval centuries, the centuries of barbarian invasions of the old Roman Empire, of wholesale destruction of books, and of near universal loss of literacy. By the 13th century, science had been reborn, but was still in its second infancy. It had a long way to go. The discovery of America served as a goad to the energetic expansion of science. So like a prompt, a catalyst, discovering America big time renewed people's interest in science. All maps had to be redrawn, and all geography had to be reconceived and rewritten. Inevitably, new questions arose in cosmology. If we had been so wrong about the continents of our own planet, what might we have been wrong about the rest of the universe? Are all human beings descended from Adam and Eve? Or is there some other explanation for the immense diversity of people? Are these natives on the far side of the globe really human? Could God have intended them to be saved by the blood of Christ when, at least before the arrival of Europeans bearing Christianity, all their dead, never having heard the gospel, had gone to hell? What does this say about God? Or what criticism might it imply about our theological or religious presumptions? In light of these things, what theological revisions might be necessary? What might we need to rethink about religion? Could these natives be surviving instances of Eden? Or are they rather subhuman, such as the monsters mentioned in the Odyssey, for instance, the cannibals, the lotus eaters, and the cyclopses, and in the books of Genesis, for instance, the Nephilim, who were believed to be the offspring of giant demons and earthly women? But if these creatures are truly human, what does it mean to be human? These may not have been questions posed by Columbus's sailors, but such questions as these threw intellectual Europe into a wild tizzy of speculation and revisionism, a confusion as unending as ours would be if extraterrestrials were to land among us, or aliens. This new world awakened a European drama of ceaseless questioning, a questioning that, like the spirits released by Pandora, could never again be contained. New World also entered common speech, serving as an everyday reference to novelty and excitement, even unthinkably exquisite experience. The mind was filled with marvels, whether related by deceptive travelers or imagined, just as generations of science fiction writers would eventually imagine fantastic voyages to other worlds. In Europe, at a safe distance from the horrors being perpetrated to the natives, America commonly served as an Eden, paradise, sometimes even an Eden of a particularly lubricious sort, seldom if ever as the hell it became for so many. So pause here and in your notes capture, how did discovering the Americas lead to new interest in science and questioning? How did it lead to the invention of race as a concept? And why did people start thinking more deeply about human nature after?